Hello and welcome to A Disagreement, a story by Ballerscheff, read by Ballerscheff. As always, remember to like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd like to uh, subscribe to the blog where I read these stories from, you can find a link to that in the description of this video. Little irritations pulled at him until he wasn't comfortable looking out of his own eyes, not with the way his house was now. He didn't know why he was in this mood. He picked up his black slippers and put them out of sight. He hated how they stood out from the beige floor and forced him to notice them. He hated too how it. He hated too. Let's see. Too how the silverware he took from the dishwasher clacked loudly as he put it away. Shouldn't she have done this? They had nothing to do with how he felt. Not really. At most, they were symptoms, not the disease itself. Not that he knew what he had caused, much less how. Even so, he told his wife, more loudly than he should have, not to make such a racket stomping around the house. He hated the sound of his voice. He already regretted the argument that was sure to follow. So much noise, when that was what he wanted to avoid. "I don't stomp," she said. She hadn't before, and she didn't now. No, unlike her husband, whose feelings seeped into his every movement, her confusion at his demand made her walk softly and with deliberation, quite contrary to her anger. She knew what he said wasn't true, but it was a little worse than that. It practically couldn't be true. She just wasn't a heavy-set person. She didn't have the weight to stomp. Nor could a storm blow her away, no matter how much her husband liked to say so. He was fond of bringing whatever expressions he used a little closer to reality. A stiff breeze couldn't take her. A storm had a better chance. She was, admittedly, a small woman, and seemed smaller still because of her stoop. 3 months ago, when everyone turned their clocks forward and lost an hour, he had made similar complaints, but could at least explain them. His wife understood him then. She had also whined about being tired. He knew he was being unreasonable now, but felt he had earned it. What was his life worth, he thought silently, if he couldn't have that? His wife stewed in her anger and confusion, unaware of his question and trying to answer her own, that is, why he said what he said. As far as he was concerned, he was partly at fault, but like the weather, these things came and went and shouldn't be given more attention than they deserved. Had she done him wrong, he would have excused her on the same grounds. He'd been in a bad mood, that was all. Didn't she know it had nothing to do with her? It was soon evening. They slept in separate rooms, whether they were going through a rough patch or not. He snored, but didn't mind that she didn't. She saw it differently. He had to get up earlier than she did, and then, in his disoriented state, get to the firm where he worked as a consultant. It was his job to find the fat in a given organization and to cut it out. No, that would be giving him too much power. He merely recommended what was best, and if those in charge wished to remain in charge, they did what he said. It wasn't about what he, Mr. George Bradley, wanted, but a matter of looking at the facts, he'd say. The facts, he'd repeat, adopting the attitude of a realist that he had during work hours and at no other time. Some people think those who work with numbers are more likely to be cold and unfeeling. Financial as well as emotional misers who squeeze blood from stones and life from those they know. That was how he tried to come off, although much friendlier, someone who helped you out of a genuine interest in your future and in his own. By framing his plans as a consequence of his client's situation, he got them to agree with him. It, whatever it was, had to be done, and something always had to be done. Otherwise, why would they hire him? He never left a client without making at least some small adjustment to their business. Over the years, his tinkering would add up to more than it seemed. The one thing he would never do was cut his legs out from under him. He put this at the end of his presentations to remind those present that he did consider some things worth keeping. All work could be done better and more cheaply, even what he and his clients did. That was more than a joke. It was the most pleasant way to say what they all knew to be true. How his wife could have used one of those. She liked to introduce herself to new neighbors as the one housewife around. It wasn't true now, and it hadn't been true when they moved in either, but she liked to do it anyway. What else could she say for herself, except that she was a housewife? Or what could she say for herself, except that she was a housewife? It was what took up most of her day. Everything but her name came later. The other women in her neighborhood worked a double shift at housekeeping and a career, whether they were married or not. She knew some of them by name and by occupation, and some she knew better still. They left for work as early as her husband did. Abigail Redmond, the lawyer who lived 2 houses to their right, drove a black SUV. She didn't know what the other women drove. Well, she knew their cars, but not their names, so it came to the same thing. Tuesday, she saw a blonde woman in a red convertible. Wednesday, a woman of the same sort, with a more sensible car in blue. Although they resembled each other, she didn't believe they were the same person. It was just as unlikely that they were sharing cars. Someday her curiosity would help her remember, and she'd ask Abigail who they were. When she and Abigail could, they met and talked as they did this afternoon. When they couldn't do that, they called each other after work. Neither had the time for much more, but she enjoyed what they did together. Abigail told her as much as she legally could about her current cases. This week she was finishing up what would have been a simple case of trespassing. What would have been a simple case of trespassing, if not for the defendants dragging it out with senseless appeals and diversions that had almost put them in contempt of court. As hard as it sometimes was, at least she wasn't a public defender anymore, and could do right by her clients. Back then, she'd had far too many to help. Abigail, like her former classmates, had thought knowing about a problem was about as good as solving it. They could manage what others said was too much. No matter what their contracts demanded of them, it was all just numbers until they began working. Abigail laughed. You can't call it arrogance, can you? I didn't have anything to overestimate. Jean spoke up. Sure you can. Unearned arrogance, she smiled. How many was it? Abigail asked herself. I think at one point I had 14 clients at once. She counted the cases off on her fingers. They weren't worth remembering, except in their total. See, she said, using her right hand a second time to count the last 4. They won't all fit. No wonder I was out of it. Needing a reprieve, she listened to Jean and agreed she wasn't someone who stomped. And George was being ridiculous, wasn't he? Neither had a solution to offer the other. Abigail's problems were too complex for Jean, whose problems were too personal for Abigail. Neither expected more than the other could give. George was also occupied with his mistake, but not as noticeably as Jean. He didn't talk about it with anyone, not even himself. Rather, it took up space on his list of what he had to do, and as this list shrank, he had less to remember and to be distracted by. He felt nothing, except that he had to face what he had done, and so there wasn't much to guess at how he felt from how he looked or moved about. He could still convince his clients of his plans, though not with his usual enthusiasm. The facts were there, but they did most of the work, rather than, as was usual, supporting him in what he proposed. When George was at his best, a client would hardly need to see the numbers all laid out. Well, a yes was still a yes, and tomorrow he would get a better one than today. 2 days after he made his complaint, he gave her the apology she needed. It was no use waiting for her to forget. She would think he was trying to wear her down. He told her about the silverware and his slippers, and then why he had snapped, all in the manner of a confession. They threw their arms around it as they talked. He apologized. She repeated how hurt she was. They attempted to explain by gesture what they couldn't get across in words. not concepts so much as the strength of their feelings. She gathered her thoughts by stirring the air in front of her. Sometimes she would stand still, but rarely. He told her to stop. She said she wouldn't, and then, continuing as promised, loosened her mouth into something that wasn't yet a smile. Having gotten her revenge, she stopped. She said she knew he didn't mean everything he said. What people said, drunk or angry, wasn't what they were really like. It was half that, and half what they were otherwise. He agreed and apologized again, hoping to somehow show that his remorse was more than half. At least now, when it was at high tide. She forgave him, something he saw in her face before she said it. He thanked her, and to give her absolute proof of his mended ways, did some of the chores she hadn't yet gotten to. Tomorrow he'd go into his office with nothing but work on his mind. She brought him tea later, something she had stopped doing in the last 2 days. He felt she had been unreasonable, which was an improvement over her being unreasonable. He had forgiven her for this, and that night he forgave himself for doing so, for apologizing over something so small, and for giving in to her demands, which she had made, as she always did, with hurt expressions that it pained him to look at, and more so to look away from, because he knew they were still there. Having worked all that out, the order of things and their various doings, he went to sleep soon after. That was A Disagreement, read by Philip Ballerscheff and also written by Philip Ballerscheff. Now, if you'd like to read along as I read that, then you can find a link to that in the description of this video. And as always, remember to like, share, and subscribe. Thanks, and until next time.